I have a question. What's the performance like of an RTX 3060 on older technologies when it comes to trying to game on them? Let's find out on Nelly's Nerd Cave today. Welcome back to Nelly's Nerd Cave, and today we're going to have a look at older technologies and how they perform under gaming conditions. Now, I know that some of us out there have some older tech, and I also know that some of the stuff that's been sold on Facebook Marketplace is particularly old. I've seen quite a lot of adverts on Facebook Marketplace for second generation processors as well as third generation advertised as gaming PCs. Let's find out if some of these actual older components can function with modern technology. My whole process with this is going to start with a few standard things. So first of all, a couple of the standard things I'm going to use is I'm going to be using my test bench. Part of my test bench has a Corsair HX620W power supply. 620 watts should be adequate for what we're needing to use this for. Also, one of the standard things is going to be a Kioxia Xera 480GB 2.5-inch SSD. This is going to have the operating system on, which is going to be Windows 10 Pro, and 3D Mark Time Spy, Port Royal, as well as a few games that I use regularly when I'm gaming anyway. And this is really going to be the basis of what we're going to use. Another thing that's going to be a standard across all the builds that I do within this series of older technologies is this. This is the Thermalright Assassin King. It's got a 120mm PWM fan, and this is an air cooler. It has 8 heat pipes and can handle up to 120 watts from what the literature tells us. The things that are relatively changeable and that are going to change over time are things like the processor, the motherboard and the RAM. I am also going to keep the same graphics cards, and I'm going to test 3 that I have. I'm going to test the GTX 970 because, again, a lot of the marketplace advertisements show a GTX 970 as part of the gaming setup. I'm going to look at the GTX 1650. This particular one is from Palette. It has 4GB of GDDR6. It runs at 1410 megahertz, is PCIe 3 and was released in around about 2020. This particular card is still being sold in my local PC world as part of a 13th generation processor. And looking at the third and final card, what I want to kind of investigate here is what types of performance impacts will a modern day graphics card have? So the final card is going to be the MSI RTX 3060 Ventus 2X with 12GB of GDDR6. It has a clock speed of 1807, it is PCIe Gen 4 and was released in 2021. Is this going to have issues? Are we going to get bottlenecks from the different processors? Would this be an adequate thing to be able to upgrade to? So, with that, let's find out. So first of all, here we have Core i3. This is a first generation Core i3. It's an i3 550. It is an socket 1156. It has 2 cores and 4 threads in total. It runs at 3.2 gigahertz and was first released in 2010. So it's a 14-year-old processor. With that, I have an accompanying motherboard. This is the BioStar H55A+. Relatively straightforward and simple motherboard, nothing too fancy. It has the Intel H55 single chip architecture as part of this, and to go with all these, unfortunately this motherboard only handles 4GB of RAM per slot. There are 4 slots within there that we can utilize. So with that, it uses DDR3. DDR3 is quite a rarity in some places, especially where I live. So unfortunately, I have mixed DDR3. They're all the same speed. They're all 1333. But I do have 2 SK Hynix, which are the, or Hynix, whichever way you say that. These are the blue ones. And then the green ones, these ones are Hyper RAM. Not sure on their greatness as such, but they're Hyper RAM. They have come from CCL because the stickers on there are CCL choice. Again, both matching pairs, giving me a total of 16 gigabytes. I want to have 16 gigabytes for each particular motherboard and chip that I use within the whole series, all the way up to the 7th gen processors. This then gives us a fair run-in on these. So I've got 488 gigabyte SSD, which is going to be the same SSD. I'm going to have 16 gigabytes of RAM, and for each one that I change, I will tell you whether it's going, what types of RAM I will be using, etc. So let's get to the build of my benchmark to be able to test these particular graphics cards. So now testing is complete. We can see here the GTX 970, and we're getting frame rates between 17 and 20 frames per second. Not very good for the GTX 970. It does only have 4 gigabytes of GDDR RAM. However, could be playable if you could get past the stuttering. As we can see from the scores, we've got a 2377, which isn't bad for a GTX 970. Now into the gameplay, we can see that Doom Eternal is running between 47 and 50 frames per second, dipping all the way down to 38 frames per second. Again, this card having 4 gigabytes of RAM does limit what it can do somewhat, but again, still quite playable. So after changing cards to the GTX 1650, which has 4 gigabytes of RAM, this card came out in 2021, and this is still peaking with frame rates of between 20 and 23 frames per second. Still not very powerful, but still being sold with 12th generation processors in my local PC world. So if we look at the scores of these, we can see that we have an overall score of 2414, which is a little bit more of an increase than the 2377 on the GTX 970. But again, it's not much, but it does have a little bit more power. When we move into Doom Eternal, we can see that our frame rates have increased slightly to 40 frames per second, peaking up to around about 50 or so frames per second, depending on what the game is trying to render at the time. But being, again, as I said, being a 4 gigabyte card doesn't really help with anything at this stage, because we're still limited by the amount of memory we have. So now on to our third and final card of the RTX 3060 from MSI, and on the Time Spy we can see that we have an increase now up to 31 to 35 frames per second, which is a really good improvement. Well, again, this particular card has 12 gigabytes of GDDR6, so we'll be a little bit snappier, and when you look through this, it is really snappy. So the scores for our final card, the RTX 3060, is 3758, which is a huge increase in comparison to the GTX 1650 at 2414, and an even bigger improvement on the GTX 970 at 2377. This will more than likely have something to do with the fact that it's got 12 gigabytes of GDDR6. When we move into gameplay and playing Doom Eternal, we can see that our frame rates have gone up to a high of around about 80 frames per second, with a low of around 55 to 60 frames per second. So this game, really playable. Camera, because I was silly, you get GPU was only running at 20% of its full potential, so a completely playable game. If not a little slow to load the in-between game sections and the different levels of the game, it's pretty good. So, can you improve the gameplay and frame rates on an old first generation i3 550? Yes, you can. Do you want to? That's entirely up to you as the user. To get the best out of this, I spent £278 on an RTX 3060, brand new from Amazon, and I placed it into this old PC. And if you want to play some gaming, and it's light gaming, then that should be fine. But don't expect it to run something like Starfield or Crysis on here anytime soon, because as we know, Crysis tends to crash everything. But that's for another video. For the money, it would be a great upgrade and would be a brilliant start for anybody looking to make that smaller upgrade. At this point, you can then take away, I'm going to update the platform after that, etc. As we go through these i3 generations, maybe some will fare better overall and be able to provide us with a greater gaming experience than the older ones. So we're going to move into the higher level ones like the 21s and etc. Hopefully you found this video useful, and if you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to help my channel keep improving, why not buy me a coffee? The links are below. And until next time, see ya.